who in your mind are underrepresented voices? What does that mean in American history, and how, as we as educators, need to do more in terms of presenting underrepresented voices?
Well, that's a great question. I think to begin, the easy answer to that is underrepresented voices are various groups who we've seen as marginal or lacking power or lacking influence in any of various narratives about American history, or even what it means to be an American. And so obviously that includes women, children, Indigenous Americans, African Americans. I also think that's a great question because it raises issues about how we define unrepresented relative to certain understandings of the American Revolution. Is the American Revolution a social movement, a cultural movement, an intellectual movement? Do we understand it from the top down in terms of the decisions that a few select people have made, or do we understand it as in some way a movement of social unrest occurring in various places throughout the colonies? And so I think a lot of recent work has emphasized the revolution as experience, and emphasized the social and even cultural aspects of the revolution. And so to do that then means that the people that we have thought of as being underrepresented because they lacked influence, they gain all sorts of significance and influence. When we look, and I should also say that the unrepresented includes people who are poor, people of the middling classes. And so all of these groups, I think, begin to have significance in the understanding of the revolution as, in fact, multiple kinds of social transformations, conflicts occurring at the same time. I happen to look specifically at African Americans, and I think then as an underrepresented group, they've been understood that way because they were the enslaved, and so the understanding has been as per their condition, they have no power, they have no influence. Certainly at the heart of enslavement is the paradox of trying to treat somebody who is human as though they're unhuman. That paradox, I think, is continually played out, and I think it highlights the fact that the enslaved do have influence in society, and that's why, as kind of previously underrepresented voices, we need to take them seriously. What does it mean when they run away? What does it mean when they write petitions? And even as recent work has pointed out, even when there are just rumors of slave unrest or slave agitation, what do those rumors mean? What is their significance? They're creating circumstances that other people that we normally attribute with having power, they are in fact reacting to their own fears. Whether the sources of those fears are true or not, I think it speaks to the power and the influence that the quote unquote underrepresented do have in revolutionary society and going forward as well.
So last week we focused on women and children, and we had a conversation and talking about the roles that women and children may contributed into the revolution, and that if it weren't for women and children, the revolution may not have taken the direction that it did. In what ways did free and enslaved Africans had that kind of contribution to the revolution? If it weren't for free and enslaved Africans, would the American Revolution taken the turn that it did?
Right. That's again a great question.
Can I jump in to add to that question?
Yeah, sure.
I just want to add something to that question. I really like the phrase that you used. People talking about revolution as experience, and I wonder if you could, in answering that Gorman's question, talk about what you mean by revolution as experience, specifically for African Americans in this context.
to take the question about revolution of experience and kind of piggyback to this question about how African Americans influenced the revolution. By revolution as experience, I mean that when we're thinking about how, well, one example would be when we're thinking about how ideas of liberalism or republicanism, or more specific, or more broadly, ideas about rights, how they percolate through society. Should we think about certain ideas about rights as emanating from learned individuals and kind of directing the course of the revolution? Or can we think about certain ideas being taken up by various groups who actually push the logic of those ideas, like liberty, like equality, to really try, on the one hand, to hold white colonial leaders to the feet to the fire, to point out kind of the hypocrisies of holding enslaved groups while arguing metaphorically that the colonists themselves are enslaved. So I think there's a way in which African Americans certainly push this ideology forward, therefore giving it more rhetorical and more political power. Even though scholars highlight the limits of this rhetoric, right? You know, after the revolution, you have, in many ways, kind of a conservative move. But nonetheless, I think it's very important when we're thinking about experience, it's the experiences of the enslaved who actually push the logic of natural rights forward. So even though they aren't producing learned documents, political philosophies about both the history or the significance of liberal ideas or Republican ideas, I think in many ways they embody the point of those ideas, and they force conversations that ultimately cannot be ignored. And if I can tie this conversation of experience even back to the issue of women and children, you know, part of thinking about experience has to do with not caricaturing or stereotyping the experience of particular groups. That can be easy to do in the sense of assuming that African Americans or indigenous peoples might have one singular response to the varied events of what we think of as the revolution. And it's important to remember that even amongst those groups, there can be very different decisions made that push political ideas and political formations in different ways. So I think it's important to remember that Black people who decides to fight with the Patriots, in some ways that's a very different, or it's a decision, I should say, that has very different consequences in some cases than the Black person who decides to fight with the British or to leave with the British. Even if you make the argument that both of those decisions are coming from the desire of freedom, there is this way in which the experiences of the enslaved demand a kind of pragmatic approach to figuring out what freedom is. And that's a really important point as well, because the revolution doesn't just kind of spring anew or out of nowhere these ideas about what it means to be free. Ideas and conditions of freedom really get worked out on a daily basis. More to the point about not wanting to kind of caricature the experiences of people of African descent, within those communities, there are these questions about what are the roles of men and women. In some of the research that I've done, it's interesting in the 1780s to see various members of the first group of Black Freemasons, who I'm assuming we'll talk about a little later, how there are certain, and you can see this by putting together a number of different records, women, or I should say wives of Black Masonic members are attending, are the kind of baptismal and godparent ceremonies of other Masons. And they're doing this at Trinity Church, which at the time was an Anglican church. which opens up another set of questions about the role of religion in the experiences of the enslaved during the revolution. But I just mentioned that to talk about how even within the experiences of a group like African Americans, we can break that down when we're thinking about gender, to see the ways in which that experience is quite, in and of itself, quite complex.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about Freemasonry and its relationship to all of this, because that opens up other series of questions and communities being formed.
Yes. So Freemasonry, I think for the uninformed public, they might think of, I don't know, some of the Dan Brown novels or kind of these broad conspiracies, these things that I suppose make for good summer reading. But historically, and Charlie, feel free to jump in. What's interesting is I think at base people should think of the Freemasons as a voluntary association, and a fraternal voluntary association that has an interesting history that dates back to the Enlightenment and even before. And so one of the ideas of Freemasonry is about emphasizing universal brotherhood, very much a kind of Enlightenment idea about equality. Freemasonry, especially for African Americans, is also interesting, however, because it is an exclusive group in many ways. And so when we're talking about how African Americans are forming community during the Revolution, I think Freemasonry plays many important roles for them. It helps to institutionalize a certain kind of leadership. It helps to organize community around a certain set of ideas, and it gives a kind of bureaucratic structure to Black leadership during the American Revolution. And it also politically connects African Americans to Great Britain. And this is a really important point, because beyond thinking about African Americans, free and enslaved, as either patriot or loyalist, thinking about African American Freemasonry begins to frame Black politics beyond those binaries, and it allows us to think about how African Americans are thinking about the relationship of the colonies to Great Britain as they're going about trying to define freedom.
That seems to me is going to become an important point in the aftermath of the revolution, as so many loyalist African Americans will go to England, become involved with a wider abolitionist movement, and then eventually to West Africa, Sierra Leone, and then eventually Liberia. That becomes part of that whole trajectory story. And I think the first African American the first African Masonic lodge is actually in Monrovia, Liberia.
That's an excellent point, Charlie. Yes, and I was going to, if you hadn't mentioned it, I was going to mention, in fact, Liberia, because that, again, gets to this issue of African Americans using the ideas of the nation, but trying to think beyond the American Revolution of where, in fact, they could create a particular geographic space to create a new vision of society, but based on, in fact, these preceding ideas. And again, that gets to the complexity of experience, because in a place like Liberia, particularly in the early 19th century, you have native-born African Americans encountering indigenous Africans, and that creates all sorts of interesting tensions.
You have a part in your dissertation talking about 1786, the African Americans in Boston petitioning. Education is one thing, or helping them expatriate someplace else. As they see the range of options they have here, and as they're trying to negotiate.
Yes, yes. And again, so the categories of patriot or loyalist don't quite fit for a group of people who certainly recognizes those categories, but really is trying to figure out in between kind of nation and empire, where they can begin to create new avenues of freedom. And going back to your question about Freemasonry, it in many ways provides a kind of broad Atlantic vehicle for trying to create precisely those kinds of opportunities, despite the fact that in many ways, as a form of leadership, while you have democracy in the lodge itself is a place that reduces membership rather than kind of expands it. And so here, the lodge stands in parallel, but also in contrast to the form of African-American churches that begin to establish themselves immediately after the revolution in Boston.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Masons and the African-American churches or the religious communities?
Yes. To answer that question, I want to take a step back to thinking about my earlier comment about Trinity Church. And so, the history of Boston is all about the history of Puritans and the history of Protestantism. And people tend not to attribute the Anglican Church to Boston's, the main narratives of Boston's history. But in the church records, you in fact see some African Americans who, before the creation, for example, of the first African Baptist church in Boston by Thomas Paul in the early 1800s, before that, you have African Americans who are members of Boston's Trinity Church. And as members of the church, they are attending each other's baptisms. They are the godparents for each other's children. Now, these are relatively small numbers, but nonetheless, the numbers of Freemasons themselves are also small. So when you're thinking about trying to, or how various groups go about creating community, and here this is an important point because we tend to think about African American communities as emerging kind of organically out of formations of resistance. But I do think if we're thinking about community as formation, as strategy, as process, I think they are very intentional about trying to adapt certain organizational forms and thinking about how to organize, create institutions, and then organize the resources of those institutions. So the important thing about this is that you see Black people creating community within white churches, even before you have the creation of formally separate African American churches. And I think that's a really important point because the broader narratives of African American history talk about the emergence of separate Black churches, the AME Church in Philadelphia, for example, as really the sources of Black institutional life in America. And so, again, thinking about Black Freemasonry, thinking about even the small numbers of African Americans who are active in white churches in Boston before the Revolution, I think adds a new dimension to that kind of a story. And again, it's all about trying to expand, open up this question of experience.
I wonder if this might be an opportunity to talk a little bit about the community of Prince Hall and his community. I think Prince Hall is, in some ways, he's a African-American, he is an African-American founding father, like Richard Allen is an African-American founding father in Philadelphia later. And I wonder if you could tell that story to us so that we have a better understanding of it from somebody who really understands Prince Hall's story, and in the context of the community in which he's operating.
Yes. So that's a great question. I want to preface my response by saying a little bit about this category of founders. And I think that the category of founders is useful because it does recognize people who are extraordinary, people who stand out in their efforts to lead other people, to disseminate ideas, particularly in this moment of, what we think of as the birth of a new nation. So I think the category of founders is quite important. But I also think the category, the founders category, can be problematic if we use it to give, in some ways, I would argue, too much significance to particular individuals at the expense of understanding their relationship to broader communities and broader sets of ideas. So I would never want a discussion of founders to stand in for a discussion about, in fact, a broader community. Because again, this idea of founders, if we take it too far, can lead us back to the whole problem of having voices that are in fact unrepresented. We see certain voices as really important, and other voices, if they don't fall into the founders category, as somehow less important. So I want to preface my comments by saying that. So Prince Hall is in many ways a founder. My work started because all of these historians were talking about this guy, Prince Hall, and their mere mention of him suggested that he was significant, but nobody was talking about him, in part because, you know, his biography is really difficult to piece together. And this also, I think, is a definition of underrepresented voices. It's those people whose archives are very difficult to reconstruct. But nonetheless, everybody's talking about him because he appears as the organizer of the first Black Freemasonic Lodge in North America, and from what I've been able to tell, pretty much the Atlantic world. There are mention of people of African descent operating in French lodges early in the 18th century, but nonetheless, in terms of the first organized Black lodge, Prince Hall led that. We see Prince Hall's name appended to a petition to the Massachusetts legislature in 1717 or 1777. Prince Hall's name is on a petition to the Massachusetts, the school officials in Boston, asking for a church, a school for Black children. Prince Hall's name is at the top of a petition of, I think it's 30 to 40 Black individuals asking for support for possible colonization. When we look through all Boston taking books, tax records from 1780 to 1800, and Prince Hall passes away in 1807. His birth date is still kind of, we're not quite sure, but early in the probably the 1730s. But Prince Hall is, of all the African Americans, people of African descent, who people described as being Black, that I found in the Boston taking books tax records, he's mentioned the most number of times. So clearly this is an individual who's significant. And so my research started from just wanting to know more about him in particular. I wasn't able to add anything more to his biography than what previous historians like Charles Wesley, for example, had done. And so I thought, well, what if I can kind of reconstruct Prince Hall's world? Right? And this led me to Boston's taking books. And so that kind of post-apocryphal approach to understanding Boston's Black community then allowed me to link all these other individuals into the lodge. And so, yes, seeing Prince Hall as a founder, but also beginning to see the community that he's helping to found. Right.
So what is his community? How would you describe his community in terms of the mix? What's in that community?
So yeah, so so Boston's community on the eve of the Revolution, I'm forgetting the exact number off the top of my head, but it's not that big, maybe around 1,000 or so, a fraction of Boston's population. And it's a population that is extremely mobile, extremely transient. It's important to note that I think in a place like Boston in general, many people, different groups in Boston, are moving to the city. They're moving away from the city. They're coming to the city. They're leaving the city. So I think transiency was characteristic of many different groups in Boston. Obviously, most of Boston's Black population are enslaved. But the slavery in Boston is of a different sort than the slavery you would encounter in Virginia or South Carolina. It's as historians make this distinction between a slave society and a society with slaves, and so Boston would be a society with slaves. It has a varied economy. It's not based upon a plantation economy. And so despite the fact that you have people in Boston who are enslaved, there is a great degree of movement amongst those people. And I think this is important to recognize for several reasons. When we're thinking about the social origins of African-American Freemasonry and the way in which African-American Freemasons are looking out from Boston to a broader Atlantic world, I think that is shaped by their social experiences from just having to move around. So I think that's an important point. And then I also think that because Black people are moving around, it raises particular issues for trying to root a community in a particular place. You certainly see in Boston a coalescence of Black people on Boston's Beacon Hill in the late 1790s. Prior to that, you see Black people who are kind of dispersed throughout Boston, and we have to remember that at that time it's actually a very, it's a peninsula with just, the neck. And so you have the population dispersed around what is essentially kind of a little bigger than a square mile, so it's not that big. And then you get all these people who begin to kind of flock together in the 1790s, and then out of that community you begin. Well, I should say, I think out of that community, there are various members who operate as members of the Black Lodge.
Mhm.
So two questions. One, how does that fit with African-American parades, the idea of kings and sort of that reversal day, that's also about community? That's one piece. And then the second piece is, what are the kinds of professions that the African Americans are involved in? Are they? I mean, obviously, many of them are going to be house servants, but also many of them may be artisans of some kind, merchants. Could you give a sense of that? Sort of two questions there.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, from that, that's an incubator for revolution or decisions during revolution.
Yes. So regarding the first question about public ceremonies, in the 18th century, and again, the sources for this are difficult, and it raises questions about the relationship of African traditions to the creation of African American identities. But nonetheless, historians have discussed what they call election days or governor's days that seem to be derivatives of various kinds of probable West African ceremonies related to creating political leadership in West Africa. And so we don't have enough material to kind of to sketch out in a very clear way the transmission of cultural transitions from Africa to the Americas. But what is clear is that there's some African influence in the ways in which the enslaved in Boston are trying to create various kinds of ceremonies to recognize forms of leadership even amongst the enslaved. So that's one thing. And so in some ways then you get a shift from kind of African inflected public ceremonies before the revolution to these public ceremonies that come after the revolution that take several different forms. Some of those for Freemasons are the celebrations of members who've passed away, kind of public processions. Others of those are in fact kind of these military marches that are ceremonial and that are meant to mark the roles of Black soldiers in the American Revolution. So that's kind of one set of answers to the first question. The second question, one of the things you see in the taking books are people described as sailors. You see a lot of people described as sailors, which gets to this whole issue of transiency. Prince Hall, records do not suggest that he actually fought in the Revolutionary War, but they do suggest that he was a leather dresser and perhaps in fact made drumheads for Patriot forces. The Massachusetts Historical Society in fact has a receipt with his signature on it apparently. I say apparently only because there were in fact multiple enslaved individuals or individuals of African descent named Prince Hall, but by corroborating various documents, it would in fact seem that this Prince Hall who signs for these drumheads was in fact the Prince Hall who helped to organize the Masonic Lodge. So a number of professions. What's also interesting about that is even though you don't have any, obviously formal schools for Black people prior to the American Revolution, the fact that Prince Hall signs his name shows that he was literate. How he gained that literacy, records don't tell us that, but nonetheless, he was literate. The issue of literacy also opens up, and this is a partial answer to this question about occupation, the life of Phyllis Wheatley. So she is interesting. She's actually married to John. Thank you, John Peters. Thank you for that, Bob, and who. Interestingly enough, is a member of the African Society of Boston, a kind of benevolent society, but was not a member of the Black Lodge. And so Wheatley, being a servant of the Wheatley family, it was, when they bought her, was assumed that she would have these kinds of domestic duties, but also in the context of Boston's slavery, serve really as a status or a symbol of the family status. In other words, they in fact had enough money to own a slave. She takes a liking, develops a relationship with one of the daughters in the family, and actually learns how to read that way. So in some ways, one of the ironies of Wheatley's enslavement is that it allows her to gain an education that, despite high rates of literacy generally in New England, she receives an education that is better than that received by most white males, in fact, in Massachusetts. So a range of,
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say a range of occupations, despite the condition of being enslaved. And these occupations, coupled with Black people moving around, reinforce the fact that the enslaved are paying very close attention to politics around them. And so then to kind of get, I think, to your third question, Charlie, about what this means for Black participation in the revolution, you have Black patriots. You also have these petitions that were written probably between, out of cooperation between whites and obviously Blacks. Those petitions begin in 1773, even before kind of formal colonial hostilities. And they kind of ramp up in their tone, in their degree of impatience. There are several that are written between 1773 and 1774. There's kind of a brief lull, and then we get this petition authored by Prince Hall in 1777. The very first petitions written in 1773 and 1774, some of those are written by individuals who go on to enter into this first Black Masonic Lodge, which was begun either in 1775 or 1776.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that beginning of the lodge and getting the charter like that.
Yes. So what's interesting, and this in some ways I think is kind of a recent development, is there are two possible dates for the beginning of the African Lodge. And this is an area of some dispute amongst African Americans. And so I just want to kind of talk about the context of that dispute. African American Freemasonry in general is in fact a living tradition. And so people today are invested in certain dates, really as kind of founding dates. And so I think one should take that into consideration and always keep that in mind. Having said that, we have what is essentially a kind of a receipt that 14 individuals were made into Masons in March of 1775. And that receipt has the name John Batt on it. If you look through Revolutionary War records and even try to trace this through post-war pension records, there are several John Batts who fought in the Revolutionary War.
Which side was he on?
The Batt who brought these African Americans into Freemasonry, it seems as though he was part of the British occupation in Boston. So on the side of the British. And it also seems that he was a member of an Irish traveling lodge. So what that means is in the history of Freemasonry, in order to be recognized as an official lodge, you need to trace your Masonic lineage back to a lodge that itself was seen as a legitimate lodge. This is for obvious reasons, because theoretically anybody could say, I'm going to open up my lodge, and how do you verify that lodge within a longer kind of genealogy of lodges? And so within the history of Freemasonry, you do have these differences between Masons who understood themselves to be modern Masons, and we tend to associate them with Great Britain, and Masons who understood themselves to be ancient Masons, and so who we tend to associate with Scotland and Ireland. And the tension really has to do with debates within Freemasonry about the origins of this fraternal group. So we think that this John Batt was part of an Irish traveling lodge that was linked to this history of ancients within Freemasonry. And so part of the question about the origins of African-American Freemasonry revolves around this issue of legitimacy. Did John Batt have the authority to make these African-Americans into a lodge? For our purposes, we're going to say he did have this authority. And so what that then means is he brings these African-Americans into Freemasonry. Those African-Americans begin to meet as a group of Masons into what we think of as African Lodge Number 1. But despite the fact that they're made a group of Masons who meets together and exercise certain Masonic rituals, they don't have the power to make new Masons. They just have the power to meet as Freemasons. And so they do that. There's another document in 1776 that also has the name John Batt on it. This document differs from the first document in that it actually talks about the different ranks that different members, African Americans, have. There is another document that we have from 1782 that's held by the Grand Lodge in London that is direct evidence of Prince Hall corresponding to the Grand Lodge in London through a network of African American sailors. Fascinating stuff. And so in that 1782 document, Prince Hall says, we've been made into a lodge. We do not have the power of making new members, but we're doing good work. 1784, you get another letter written to the Grand Lodge in London, which constitutes a formal request for this African Lodge in Boston to receive a charter from the Grand Lodge in London that would allow the African Lodge Number 1 to be recognized so that it could actually make its own members. They actually received that charter again through a network of African American sailors in 1787.
So this process begins when the British are occupying Boston.
Correct.
And it ends after the independence of the United States.
Correct.
Yes, so it's a fascinating trajectory. Now, why didn't they initially go to the Grand Lodge in Boston? Is there any evidence?
There is evidence that they went to they went to the St. John's Lodge in Boston, which going back to this kind of tension within Masonry, which was a modern lodge. There's an argument that they went to John Warren for a lodge.
Was it Roe or Warren?
Forgive me, John Roe. Thank you for that correction. That they went to John Roe and that they were given a temporary lodge. This narrative gets complicated, in fact, by the revolution, because one of the things that happens is that severs then, in some interesting ways, the relationships between American lodges and the Grand Lodge in London. So it raises all these new issues about jurisdiction and authority. So yes, Prince Hall has this, we're going to call it a temporary permission to meet as a lodge, but that does not give them the ability to make new members. And they only gained that in 1787.
Wow. Yeah. Amazingly complicated story too, with Masonry, with these communities, and just trying to piece this together from the evidence available. How you get this story.
Right. And it's, again, thinking about underrepresented voices, you're using kind of basic tools of social history, tax records, church records, to try to gain a sense of names that begin to pop up time after time, and then also trying to differentiate names that pop up time after time. You know, is it Prince Hall of Medford, the same Prince Hall that existed here in Boston? And if you can begin to pinpoint some of those names, then you can begin to kind of open up these institutional histories, because you have a bit of knowledge about the backgrounds of these individuals who are moving around. In some cases, it's fortunate that somebody like Prince Hall really appears in 1777. We don't know a lot about him prior to that, but that after that, you see his name everywhere up until his death in 1807.
What advice might you give to, say, a teacher who or class that wanted to find out more about underrepresented folks in their own community?
You know, that's a great question. I would say that, you know, I did a lot of my research at the Boston Public Library, the Athenaeum, the Massachusetts Historical Society. Certainly the Athenaeum and the Massachusetts Historical Society can seem like intimidating places, and they aren't really. But having said that, you know, the Boston Public Library certainly is not. You know, perhaps one might have to ask a few people to find out where the reading room is. But you know, these are public institutions, and every community has them. And you know, it's very easy to just go to your library, go to the information desk, and begin to ask what kinds of local resources that they have. During the research that I did, I wound up having a lot of conversations with people doing genealogical work and with folders kind of this thick who would want to give me these fascinating stories about relatives. And I think for many of them, they provide, again, a great answer to your question, that the process of beginning to search for underrepresented voices doesn't have to be an intimidating one. You know, there are other resources here in Boston, the New England Historic and Genealogical Society, wonderful resource, open and inviting to everybody. So that's one answer. I also think that, you know, in terms of different institutions, so, you know, Freemasons themselves, local lodges will keep records. One of the responses I get in studying Freemasons is, oh, well, they're a secret society. How do you even begin to do that research? And I found that Masons are quite happy, actually, to tell people about their histories, and they've been quite inviting to me in terms of gaining access to their historical records. So my first thing would be that the research doesn't have to be intimidating. There are all sorts of local and public institutions that want people to come and ask questions about women, children, African Americans, Native Americans, and quote unquote people that you wouldn't normally think of as being important, regardless of kind of their race or gender.
One of the keys that seems to be coming out of what you're saying is it's about empowerment, agency, individuals making choices. And that's a message for teachers in the classroom. How do we teach that? How do we show people who are making these kinds of choices and the diversity with which the African American community operated in Boston becomes part of that story too. You know, the story of BAT, and then how BAT is going to initiate these 14 people. Why do they choose to do that? What kind of power do they gain from doing that? What kind of leadership within the community do they gain, and how does the community support them? That's a story of the revolution and a change in if you will, empowerment and rights. So I think it's an exciting story to tell, it's more than just the story, though. It's the process, you're saying. It's the process of then going out and finding this material, going to the Boston Public Library or going to New England Historic Genealogical Society, and then taking hold of it themselves. Is that part of what you're saying? I don't mean to be putting words in your mouth. I'm just trying to summarize what I'm hearing.
What I'm saying. That's a great emphasis. And so I think empowerment can happen on multiple levels. It can happen for the people today who are beginning to do this research, because this kind of research allows them to see themselves in histories that they might not have thought that they were a part of. And I also think when we're looking at the revolution itself, yes, choices is a great way of framing the possibilities that the revolution begins to open up. I do want to say at the same time that choices also stand in tension with the ways in which the revolution opens up this issue of choice, but then, from within the revolution, but also, and perhaps more particularly after the revolution, certain choices are closed down. I think that's a tension that we always need to keep apparent. And to say then that this makes the issue of choice, I think, that much more significant and that much more useful, that as the enslaved are trying to use the revolution for their benefit, and as they are running up against the limits of the revolution, they don't stop making choices. And they don't stop trying to create space for themselves, not only to push forward some of the logics of the revolution, but to create community and spaces that don't necessarily have to be dependent upon the logic of the revolution itself.
In terms of the aftermath of the revolution, the significance and the role of free and enslaved Africans, accelerating 50 years after, 100 years after, the role of free and enslaved Africans during the American Revolution, how did that propel them towards, civil rights?
Yes. Yes.
Even to race relations today.
Yes.
Where's the connection for that?
Yes. Just off the top of my head, there's this fantastic book by Martha Jones. It's just come out. It's called Birthright Citizens. That's looking at all of those issues in Baltimore, kind of at the very beginning of the 19th century, and then going forward. I just want to throw that book out there as a relatively new and wonderful resource. In the context of my own work, and looking specifically at Freemasonry as a way to answer your question, from its inception up to the present, there have been several very important African American leaders who've been Freemasons. So that's kind of very, going up to the present, that's one answer. Going into the 19th century, many people know about David Walker. He writes this appeal that is quite radical, and it's really calling the South to account for slavery. And David Walker goes so far as to make this argument, and that encourages slave uprising, slave resistance, slave revolt in the South. And for Walker, he's using this Christian language from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, to really talk about slave resistance in the context of a kind of biblical vision of God making America account for its sins. So it's quite radical. And many people understand David Walker, in fact, as a radical. And what's interesting is very few people, even though it's mentioned in a lot of the secondary literature, very few people know that David Walker was a Freemason. And even those who do know that David Walker was a Freemason don't do a lot with that. It raises very interesting questions about the radicalism that he expresses and the activism that I attribute, in fact, to the earliest Freemasons. I think on the one hand, there is a kind of genealogy from the Revolution to the 1830s and somebody like David Walker that we can trace through Freemasonry. I also think, though, that there is this interesting tension between, again, the Masons as a group who are exclusive, who are invested to a certain degree in ideas of kind of respectable behavior, and then but then also too a kind of radicalism that wants to challenge American nationalism. So Freemasonry allows us to kind of frame that challenge, and then that challenge in many ways becomes the challenge for African Americans moving out of the 19th century into the 20th century. Kind of put into the simplest terms, how do you both fit into something while trying to transform it? In more kind of complex terms, we then have kind of different historical periods. And so kind of David Walker marks this transition from thinking about abolition as something that is compensated, that is gradual, that happens without any significant violence, to kind of, the Civil War era, and thinking about abolition as something that in fact is quite violent, something that is immediate, and something that, at least to some degree, is uncompensated. And so, broadly speaking, the underrepresented voices, that category, people of color, people of African descent, they are vital, they are central to these stories. And of this narrative of this constant struggle in American history broadly, one, to expand rights, but then for there always to be these kind of counter-revolutionary moments where there's a conservative move to restrict rights. Unfortunately, I don't think that we exist at a moment outside of that kind of cycle. And I think at any moment in history, you can identify groups that we would normally think of as underrepresented. And if we're going to have histories that are able to kind of push us out of this cycle of expansion and then contraction, understanding these underrepresented voices and really bringing them to the fore, I think has to be a part of that larger process of writing narratives that talk about the influence of all of these people who've really been on the side of trying to expand rights, trying to expand liberty.
All right. Charlie, do you have any other questions?
Well, I was just going to birthright citizenship here.
Oh, fantastic.
That's not a question. It's interesting though. I think there's been a lot of work in Boston done about African American patriots involved with Bunker Hill, for example. There was a whole Patriots of Color project done by the National Park Service, looking at African Americans who fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill on the Patriot side. And then you have Gary Nash's work on Agrippa Hull, who is an African American who becomes Thaddeus Kosciuszko's, I think it's Thaddeus, yes, Thaddeus Kosciuszko's right-hand man throughout aide de camp throughout the Revolution. Free African Americans. And then we have stories, other stories. Many of these we'll talk about later in our course. But what strikes me in what you're saying is most of the stories that I've heard in Boston, Massachusetts, tend to be patriots, and you're saying it's a much more complicated story. And not only is it more complicated because this initial moment of this Irish, I think he's an Irishman, isn't it? John Batten, an Irishman,
Yes.
who initiates these guys. I'm not, initiating guys into Freemasonry, and then this legacy of Freemasons who are trying to negotiate kind of an interesting position. It's a mutual aid society, it's a supportive society, but it's an exclusive society. That story is a far more complicated and a far more real story than sort of simply everybody in Massachusetts joined in and wanted to be on the Patriot side. So I appreciate the complexity that you're giving us at the ground level. I don't know, Bob, does that resonate with you, Bob?
This is terrific. Yes, it really is, because it's a much more interesting story the more you know about it, the more you look at all of these players involved. So yeah, it's a great way you're opening this up to ask new questions and think about who were these people and what were they trying to achieve.
There's some other, your comments are reminding me of the recent book by Mitch Katchen about Crispus Attucks. And that is a wonderful book because it certainly recognizes Crispus Attucks as this Revolutionary War hero, but it also historicizes that memory. And so it begins to talk about how the memory of Crispus Attucks at certain points in time, kind of immediately after the revolution, is used in a particular kind of rhetorical fashion, and then people kind of forget about him, and then they kind of resurrect him again, and how different groups, African Americans, but other groups too, in terms of how they're thinking about Boston's position in particular in the revolution, use him, and part of the story there is he becomes a hero for a particular understanding of the Patriots. Right. And, recent work that talks about rumor, I'm thinking of Robert Parkinson's book, also I think in some ways speaks to this issue of how even patriots might have been fearful. I'm talking about white patriots. White patriots might have been fearful of the consequences of African-American soldiers in the Revolutionary Army. Right. So in other words, the revolution is this moment that opens up democratic possibilities in ways that all of these groups hadn't expected. So, whites who certainly lie outside of this category of founders, Revolutionary War white soldiers who might be fighting on behalf of the new nation, might stand up and say, well, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't necessarily think about fighting side by side Black soldiers. What exactly does that mean? And so I raise this issue just to talk about how even if we think about the category of patriot, again, when we're thinking about the experiences of different groups, even that category and how different people appropriate that category becomes very complicated. Patriot could mean very different things to different groups, even if they're invested in possibly giving up their lives for a particular cause.
Well, and then that extends out to this sort of dual revolution that at least the National Park does a great job in talking about.
Yes.
In Boston, particularly, this dual revolution. Boston as an incubator of this rhetoric of liberty, and then how that extends out into the rhetoric of liberty and equality with abolition. And pointing out that Prince Hall is in the revolution, and then David Walker, how much that, what are the legs of that into abolitionist Beacon Hill? There's this wonderful, story. Again, Prince Hall, you're saying, is advocating for schools for Black children, and then you get the story of Sarah's Long Walk, Sarah Roberts, and trying to integrate the schools in Boston in the 1840s and 50s, and abolitionist fervor has taken over. There's a trajectory and a connection and a link there that's pretty clear, I think, in what you're saying.
Yes. If I can just add to that, that's very well put, that Black Freemasonry provides these and Black Freemasonry in particular provides these interesting continuities between kind of the Revolutionary era and the antebellum period. And one example of that would be the backlash to Freemasonry, more broadly speaking, in the 1820s and the 1830s. And this raises very interesting questions about the relationship between Black institutions and government at both the state level, primarily at this point the state level, but also the federal level. So, in the 1820s and the 1830s, you were having the effects of disestablishment. And in Massachusetts, the Grand Lodge, its state charter is actually taken away because it's seen as this new threat to state authority. And this is actually a question that I haven't worked out relative to African Americans. I'm not clear that they even asked for a state charter to recognize their lodge. But what this does is it raises interesting questions about how African Americans are trying to position themselves vis-a-vis state authorities. They are asking state authorities for Black schools, and that makes a lot of sense. But perhaps it makes sense not to ask for a state charter to incorporate the lodge, especially if they're seeing all of this backlash to white Freemasonry more broadly. And again, this is a question that I haven't completely worked out, but it does speak to the ways in which Black Freemasonry, as a kind of incorporated body, is being used by African Americans, I think, in very strategic ways relative to various kinds of moves to gain legitimacy, to gain education, to create and to gain a bit more freedom. And gosh, there's something else.
I think they struggle.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think the African Lodge struggles a little bit with Grand Lodge, with the Massachusetts Grand Lodge as it emerges, and some of the ancient lodges have trouble becoming part of this the new Massachusetts Lodge. But I think Paul Revere ends up being sort of an incubator to help bring the lodges in.
Yes, this isn't what I was trying to remember, but by the 1820s, you actually get I think it's 1828, the African Lodge number 459 declares itself a Grand Lodge. Which is a very interesting move. By the late 1820s, you've had the establishment of African American lodges in New York, in Philadelphia, I think, in fact, also in Providence, Rhode Island as well. So you begin to get then this conversation amongst Black lodges about legitimacy even within African American Freemasonry. And to be clear, even though I'm using this term African American Freemasonry, Black Masons use all the same ritual as you find in broader Masonry. The distinctions really lie in terms of issues of race and meeting.
Incidentally, I'm aware that lodges today, the Massachusetts Lodge, there are African Americans in the if you will, non Prince Hall Masonry,
Yes,
as well as in Prince Hall.
Yes,
today.
Yes. And in fact, I think there are also some white people who are members of African American lodges as well. Yeah, so there is an overlap, despite the fact that you have this continued racial line.
Yeah, interesting.
Right. Well, during the Revolutionary era, or the late 18th century, let's say, the Jeremy Belknap, one of Boston's most esteemed leaders and intellectuals in late 18th century, he is asked by a Virginia jurist to talk about how abolition happened in Massachusetts. And so at this point in Virginia, in the late 18th century, you have an increase in people who are manumitting their slaves. Virginia has its own history relative to slavery. It has a very large enslaved population, but it didn't have the kind of plantation economies that you find in the Deep South, like South Carolina. And so, there is this moment where you have these conversations in Virginia about the possibility of abolishing slavery. And so St. George Tucker writes to Jeremy Belknap, and Belknap sends out these questionnaires to various leading lights in Boston at the time. One of those is in fact Prince Hall. And so in those queries, Prince Hall, other leading lights, John Rowe, in fact, talk about how they understood the process of abolition to happen in Massachusetts. And Belknap essentially asks Prince Hall what had been the relationships between whites and blacks in Massachusetts. I think we have to read Prince Hall's response with some grain of salt, because he's cognizant of a broader audience of white Freemasons. I think Prince Hall is occupying this very interesting line between wanting to be recognized by a larger kind of white Masonic body, but also wanting to remain separate to some degree. This is also an issue with the emergence of black churches. So Prince Hall says that the relationships are fairly good, but that generally we don't attend kind of each other's meetings. There is correspondence from Philadelphia, and I spent far less time, admittedly, with those sources, but to some degree you have whites who are attending what becomes kind of Bethel Lodge in Philadelphia. That lodge is organized in the 1790s. So you do in the Revolutionary era, I don't think there's a lot of kind of interracial activity between black lodges and white lodges, even though white lodges do recognize Prince Hall as legitimate. But for the legitimacy of the African Lodge, they see their legitimacy as deriving from the Grand Lodge of London, and it's really that relationship that they rely upon. There's correspondence, but certainly there's not an extensive beyond communication. They're not Masons from London, or even Masons from Irish or Scottish lodges who are coming to spend time at the African Grand Lodge. And then in the 19th century, many members of the African Grand Lodge are part of kind of a growing radical or immediate abolitionist movement in Boston. One of the things that I have not charted are members of white lodges in Boston who are also part of the abolitionist movement, and what those ties might mean. But that's certainly one of the kind of the avenues that I'm tracing in my current work now.
So what questions do you have now that you're exploring further research?
Well, certainly it's this issue. I'm interested in this issue of voluntary associations in Massachusetts in the 1820s and 30s, broadly speaking, there's a lot of great work that's been done looking at that and how Black Freemasonry fits into that. I'm also interested in the broader Atlantic spread of Black Freemasonry to the Caribbean, and then also to Africa. One of the interesting things that you see when you spend time with records in the Grand Lodge in London is that different groups, of African descent, Western European descent, are creating lodges all throughout the Atlantic world. There are questions about African Freemasonry or Afro-French Freemasonry in the French Revolution. These are all broader questions that, while they don't relate directly to the work that I'm doing now, which is really focused on Boston, they are questions that I'd like to explore going further, because what they do is they expand this conversation about kind of unrepresented voices in the context of the US as a nation, really to a broader context of colonialism and thinking about how colonized voices, or people who have been colonized, I should say, are trying to resist that, fight against that, adopting some of its own structures and metaphors to create their own movements for freedom and equality.
I'm thinking about your talk yesterday at the Shear Conference, where you were talking about historicizing Africa in the context of the American Revolution. And I happened to have had the opportunity back in April to go to the Grand Lodge in Monrovia, Liberia, and tour it with the, it's been restored after many years of civil war and destruction. And the pride of these Freemasons taking me around this, and this incredible collection of women that are very much involved with Freemasonry in Liberia. And I'm thinking about that relationship between Africa, West Africa particularly, Freemasonry, and this kind of Atlanticized world as it extends out. How do we historicize Africa into the picture of Freemasonry in post-revolution?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it will rely upon the work that Africanist historians are doing, and some of it too, will rely upon new resources that we have. So there's this wonderful database, Slave Voyages, that charts all of these travels across the Atlantic. It really is a wonderful teaching tool to give students a sense of both space and time in talking about slavery, particularly in its transatlantic dimensions. I find that many times students think about slavery as something that happens to a particular individual, and they're imagining a particular kind of slave, and they're thinking about slavery, at least in North America, in terms of the American South, and they don't have a sense of its chronology. And so I think there are these wonderful tools that are increasingly allow us to understand African history on its own, and then will allow us to think about kind of African histories and the revolution, for example, in comparative terms. There are obvious problems with comparison because you can't kind of map what's happening in one place directly on to what's happening onto another place. But what that comparison does allow us to do is to think about how different communities are thinking about human relationships in very different ways. What does slavery look like in West Africa as compared to what it looks like in North America during the American Revolution? And even thinking about different forms of slavery, I think helps to open up the imaginations of underrepresented voices, of people who are taken from various places in West Africa during the late 18th century that are experiencing their own forms of revolution, and are perhaps bringing those kinds of experiences with them. I think another answer to your question has to do with just access. And so you know, this is kind of part of my research is to get to the Grand Lodge in Monrovia. The fact that it's been restored, you know, without that kind of work to restore those institutions and to keep their archives, you can't do the work. So I think you know, part of new work that's being done on Africa, and even work that has existed since the 1960s and the 70s, is making use of archives in multiple languages that we're fortunate enough to have, or that have been, you know, kept in various kinds of circumstances. Some of those precarious, but nonetheless, now they're available to us. And you know, if we, and it takes a lot of work, travel, multiple languages, but nonetheless, I think that this is information that can really help us to think about our own ways of thinking about revolution and nation, and even underrepresented voices in new ways. You know, underrepresented voices in West Africa in the late 18th century might be a very different thing when you're thinking about slavery there as opposed to slavery here. And I think that's really important for our students to think about, especially in a world that is quite global and only seems to be becoming more so. You know, when I teach, I'm certainly talking about the nation in formal ways. So, you know, I want my students to be able to recognize the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And, you know, I want them to know very basic things about when those documents were written. What are those documents trying to do? What was the process that led to each of those documents? And I think very basic information like that is vital to being an informed citizen, to a sense of not only belonging, but active participation. At the same time, when I'm talking about underrepresented voices in the American Revolution, I also want my students to think about the nation as something constructed. So it's not just something that they belong to, but I do think it's something that they themselves, even in their everyday lives, are helping to shape in ways that are implicit and explicit. And so that means that even while we might be want to teach our students how to be good citizens, that doesn't mean we take the nation for granted or that we take citizenship for granted. It's always something that's in formation. I mean, even our current controversy about how we will write the census, I think highlights the fact that teaching civics, I think, also requires that we teach students that the nation is something that is constructed. And so it can be here today, but it can also be gone tomorrow. So belonging doesn't just mean that it's there and you are part of it and that's the end of the story. It does mean that one has to be active in both trying to be a citizen, but also trying to shape what citizenship means.
It's kind of like thinking about, you know, Franklin when he just says, you know, the republic, if you can keep it.
Right.
It's a responsibility
Yes.
that we need to continue and sustain, and we don't.
Yeah. And hopefully that will get students thinking about their responsibilities to each other.
Yeah.
Yes.
And kind of what that means.
Yeah.
You know, you all are doing this work, right? That of public history, really, so that the work of academic historians is really making its way into kind of K through 12 education, high school education, and just a broader public in general is really important and inspiring.
Well, thank you for your inspiring work, and let's us be in touch.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. This has been great.
Hey, thank you.